Professor Martha Craven Nussbaum, 2021 Holberg laureate. First of all, a heartfelt congratulations.
Thank you very much, and very good to meet you.
Likewise, absolutely. Now, in preparing for this interview, this talk, it's become ever more clear what a daunting task it is, because I think although you are a very public figure and everyone knows about this or that side of Martha Nussbaum, it's just astonishing the number of topics that you cover, the number of subjects and fields that you make an impact in, and how you manage to combine them and often break borders or barriers. So in one way, it's such a broad landscape and so many things that it's difficult to see how to sort of even get started on your massive work in the course of a conversation. But you've given us some help in, I think, saying something very crucial about sort of common denominator and an origin of the engagement for, if not all, then a lot of your important work. And that is that it's kind of a reflection and investigation into human vulnerability. And I think one really good place to start here is with your theory of the emotions, in order to get more of a concretization of what this might mean, the idea of this fragility of goodness, to use a well-known phrase. And one thing that's characteristic of your approach to the emotions is, in one word, that they are cognitive. Now, to many, cognitive would simply mean, well, then probably it's on the form of language, or it's like a verbal thing. But that's obviously not quite what you have in mind. So specifically, when we talk about the emotions, what does it mean that they are cognitive?
Well, okay, I use cognitive in the way that most scientists who work on animal emotions use it, namely, cognitive faculties are faculties that are capable of taking in and processing information about the world. And of course, by now, scientists agree that virtually all animals have emotions. They have to have them because they can't find out what's going on in the world if they weren't endowed with the wherewithal to have fear and love and grief. Then they would be world blind and they probably wouldn't survive. So emotions are a very important survival mechanism, and scientists by now think that they belong to pretty much all vertebrates and maybe some invertebrates. But in human beings, I think the cognitive nature of emotions is socially transmitted. That's also true for quite a lot of other animals. We learn, I think we're endowed at birth with the capacity to have fear, particularly fear. That's the earliest emotion. And then as time goes on, society influences what we fear, who we fear, and then we develop other emotions that we did not have at birth. For example, anger requires causal thinking. You have to think someone did something bad to me. So anger is not something that very young babies have. But researchers now think that children as young as 1 year old already have anger. They have experiments where children look at puppet plays, where one puppet hits another with a stick, and they notice that these children, before they can even use language, display pleasure or displeasure at what's going on in these puppet shows. So in that way, they've been able to pinpoint pre-linguistic anger. There's some that are even later. I would say compassion is one of the latest ones, because compassion requires perspectival thinking. I have to look at the world from someone else's point of view in order to see that that person is suffering something bad. So that can't develop right away, but I think pretty soon we are mind readers, so to speak. We are able to inhabit the perspective of someone else. And although I think only some animals have compassion, only the ones that are capable of inhabiting the perspective of some other creature. Pretty much all humans have that, and so we develop those abilities as time goes on. Now, there the problem kicks in, because society teaches us a lot about what things are valuable, what things are not valuable, and in that way shapes our emotions. So the emotions that we have are not necessarily very reliable. We have fear, of course, about some things that are really fearful, death and illness and so forth. But we learn to fear a lot of things that are not really bad, like people from other racial groups. We're often taught to fear people who look different from us. Some people are taught to fear people from other religions. So society gets to work mapping the things we fear, the things for which we have grief. And sometimes that's rightly done, and it's normatively good, but very often there's distortion. So when you think about compassion, I think pretty much every human being has compassion for the sufferings of some other people. But which ones? Most people feel compassion only for people who are like them. We all feel compassion when our family members are ill, but of course somebody on the other side of the world, and let's say now the people, I work a lot on India, so I'll mention India, people in India who are suffering from the terrible COVID situation. Most Americans don't know much about that, and most Americans do not feel a strong emotion of compassion. Or if they do, because they just read the newspaper, it doesn't last very long, it goes away very quickly. So our strongest and most motivating emotions, unfortunately, are very narrow and very one-sided. And I think one of the great tasks of moral development is to broaden our emotions so that we have compassion for people we don't know, people in other parts of the world, and so on. But it's really very, very difficult. And I've been corresponding a lot with people who say, oh, now it's so great, the COVID has gone away. What they mean is that here in Chicago or maybe other parts of the US, things are much better. But they're not even thinking about other countries in which it's getting worse. So that's the trouble with the way people are. And we really have to work against that. But all of that is cognitive. We take in views, both good and bad, about what's important, what's not important, and then our emotions follow along with that.
To follow up on this, it's on the one hand, the uncovering of the emotions as cognitive then means that there is perhaps hope of altering them as well, for instance, like carrying out a sort of critique of the emotions, coming to see their shortcomings, and also coming to see that it's not as if it's an emotion, then it's good. If it's an emotion, we have to ask which emotion and which shape does it have and which history.
Well, and it's not just which emotion, but it's which object of the particular. No one would probably say that all fear is bad. We got to have some fear or else we'd all be dead. If we didn't have fear, we would walk out into traffic. We wouldn't protect ourselves against disease. But it's a question of what objects are the fear is directed toward and how vulnerable it is to rhetorical manipulation. So yeah, it's both good news and bad news, right? If the emotions were just hardwired, then we wouldn't be able to change them, but at least they'd be pretty stable and they couldn't be manipulated by political dictators. But because they can be socially manipulated, they can get worse. But of course, they can also get better. If you compare human emotions to the emotions of other animals, I think you see this right away. Because if I think of the emotions of an elephant, elephants feel fear, they feel love, they feel grief, but it's all very steady and stable because most of their emotions are based on both inherited tendencies and then a kind of social learning in the group that's pretty stable and pretty constant over time. Human emotions are all over the place. One day you might feel good about something, and then a political speech is made, you're very swayed by that, and you flip over to the other side. And so we are very unstable in our emotions. So yeah, you're right that the fact that they're cognitive, not only cognitive, but socially shaped, that's good news in a way, but it's also bad news because it means they can so easily be misshapen and distorted. So I think that the job that we have to do is to really have a good normative theory and try to get societies and families to shape children's emotions in the right way. Now, in a way, we know that. Parents always know that they want their children to control their anger, not to feel anger at some other child who's playing with them. And so they shape their children's emotions. And they say, well, now, look, that was not something you should feel angry about. Or they also encourage compassion. Look at what happened to Susan. She lost her toy that she was playing with. You should really help her, and you should feel sorry for her. So parents shape children's emotions in many ways. But of course, sometimes they do it very badly. They encourage racism, they encourage sexism, and almost without knowing it. There are a lot of experiments where people are given a baby to hold, and the baby is not labeled as to whether it's male or female. And right away, the experimental subjects impute emotions to that baby not, because of the sex that it's labeled as. So, for example, they hand the baby to me, I'm the experimental subject, and the experimenter says, oh, please hold her for me. Now, then the experimental subject typically says, oh, poor thing, she's so frightened, and they hold the baby close. But if the experimenter says, please hold him for me, they behave very differently. They bounce the baby in the air and they say, oh, he's angry, he wants to get what he wants. So they're shaping the emotions of that baby by the very way they hold the baby, by the very way they name the emotions, because after all, the baby is just crying, and one cry is pretty much like another. And as time goes on, the idea that little girls are fearful and timid and that boys are assertive and aggressive takes root in the child and in the family. So that's the kind of thing that happens to distort emotions. And so even it may be that even our fear of death is a distortion. All right, my own work on this began with the ancient Greeks and Romans. And the ancient Greeks and Romans were very extreme about this. They said that pretty much all the emotions that we learn in society are based on false beliefs. Namely, they're based on the belief that something outside yourself that's not in the control of your own reason and will is very, very important. Now, they thought that nothing that's not in the control of your rational will is very important. You should just retreat into your inner world, so to speak, and say, well, all of that stuff outside, that's nothing to me. But of course, most people are not like that. They think that the deaths of loved ones are terrible. They think that their own illnesses are terrible. So Seneca and the Stoics, and indeed the Epicureans too, said we should not have those fears. And the beliefs that underlie them are false beliefs, namely that illness is something terribly important, etc. So then they set about to try to teach people to root up the emotions. They wanted to eradicate them totally and have people who were stable, content with their own reasoning, and not affected by the outside things in the world. Now, I don't believe that the normative view they have is correct. I think that they were right about some things. I think it's probably bad to be too upset when you lose some money. It's bad to be upset at insults to your honor and reputation. They talk about that kind of thing a lot. But, you know, if your loved one dies, of course it's right to be terribly upset. So I think. So my view is a lot more complicated, and it means that basically what happens in Greek tragedy gives us a good roadmap to follow as we educate our emotions. My work on emotions began with work on Greek tragedy, and I think there's good reason for that, although I didn't really know it at the time. Namely, Greek tragedies show bad things happening, but they're the things that really are important. The loss of a country, the loss of a city, the deaths of loved ones, yourself being put into slavery. All of these things are really, really important. And therefore, we should feel fear of that happening. We should feel grief about those things happening. And when it happens to somebody else, we should feel a powerful compassion. So I think the Greek tragedies are, for the most part, a roadmap of the important emotions, but notice that they do not show people being very, very upset when they lose a little money. That's more like the stuff of comedy. People who behave like that are laughed at and they're silly. And so we kind of get a moral education out of tragedy. Some things are really worth caring about and some things are not. And I actually think that tragedy, which was, of course, performed for the whole city, adults and young people alike, it really was a form of moral education for the emotions of the citizens. We don't have anything like that now because there's no really, the arts can't be public in the same way. There's no way of having an entertainment that everyone comes to and you sit on a holiday and you see all your fellow citizens around you. But we can turn to the arts still for examples of emotions. And I think we still do have some public emotion festivals, so to speak, particularly in the visual arts, like a work of architecture can educate the emotions of a city. I've talked about Millennium Park in downtown Chicago, which is a park that celebrates civic unity. And it celebrates it both with serious images of joy and celebration and with comic images, because there's a thing called the Crown Fountain that displays different Chicagoans of different races and ages, but their images are distorted on a large screen, and then water shoots out of the mouth of the image. So it's really very funny if you stand there and watch it. And I think it's very inviting. People always want to go in the pool and paddle around, and it brings us together in laughter at the human body and how strange it is. So there are different ways that cities and countries can have of bringing people together in emotion celebrations. We've just had yesterday, or Monday rather, our Memorial Day, where we have a communal celebration in honor of soldiers who have died in different wars. And that's another way that countries celebrate important things, coming together around central losses that we all share as a nation. So I think despite the fact that modern nations are too big to have Greek tragic festivals, there's still things we can do. And that's why I think the arts are such an incredibly important part of our public culture, both music and literature, theater. So one of the most successful dramas of recent years in the US, but I think it's been in Europe a lot too, is Lin-Manuel Miranda's play Hamilton. It's, of course, about the founding of the United States, and it contains many emotions. The characters, some of them are aspiring with energy and joy to create something new. And then there's Aaron Burr, who feels envy, and he wants to harm Hamilton because Hamilton is getting good things that he's not getting. And the audience is enlisted on the side of creation and joy, and we learn to disapprove of envy and spite that tries to harm somebody who's doing something good. And of course, all of this is set in the context of the American founding, but it's performed by a group of multiracial actors. So what we learn to understand is that our founding was not just by white people, it was by people of various races. Hamilton himself was biracial. But we also learn that we have to be in it together, or we don't do anything fine at all. So that's an example of a work that educates the citizen, so to speak, and I think does it really well. But Of course, you have to pay a lot of money to get a ticket, and it's, the typical thing with Broadway stage, it's very exclusionary in terms of who actually gets to see it live. So the arts need to think much more about how we bring people in, bring people together without segmenting them into the people who have a lot of money and the people who don't. But anyway, that's a way that cultures can educate the emotions of citizens. Of course, the Greeks, when they criticized the emotions, they said something that's quite right, namely that they all have something in common. They all impute a very high value to things outside yourself that you don't fully control. Now, there may be exceptions. I think perhaps the emotions of wonder and awe may be exceptions to that. But most of the major emotions, if you once form a strong attachment to something outside yourself, let's take the example of a child, then you'll have fear when that child is threatened. You'll have anger when somebody else damages the child. And of course, you have ongoing love for the child. You'll have compassion when the child is suffering, and then pretty much all the others follow along with that. So yeah, they have this one thing in common. And so the Stoics thought that if you can only learn to get rid of these unwise attachments to things outside yourself, then you get rid of them with one stroke. Now, they also knew that that was very hard to do. So in their practical teaching, they tried to work on specific emotions, and they conducted therapeutic treatments of anger that were different from their therapeutic treatments of grief. But in the end of the day, it all comes down to what you love. If you don't love anything but your own rational will, then you don't get bothered by any of these emotions at all.
Yes, exactly. So what you show, I think, beautifully, for instance, in the therapy of desire, is the drama of this, how one might wish to hold on to some emotions because they seem like good and excellent things, and then other things do not seem good. So one might then dream of we want to hold on to love because love is beautiful and great, but we don't want fear or grief or anger. But as you show so beautifully in that book too, it's not easy to get one without the other. So if you have love for someone outside yourself and there's a threat to them, you feel fear. And if someone hurts them, you feel anger. If it should come to the worst, you feel grief. So it seems as if in that classical critique and your presentation of it, it's very much a sort of take it or leave it package almost.
It is in a way, but I've made refinements on that as the years have gone on. First of all, I think that the emotion of disgust, which is very damaging socially and politically, is one that we can diminish greatly. So, okay, disgust is a very strong reaction, but it's still cognitive. And what researchers who work on it show is that it always involves ideas of bodily contamination. You don't want to be touched, or you don't want to ingest something that you view as polluting. Now, the things that are objects of disgust are animal parts and animals that remind you of your own animality. So they call it animal reminders. And why do we have disgust at animal reminders? Well, because we don't want to see ourselves as animal and mortal ourselves. But of course, that's a lie. So even the basic experience of disgust toward feces, bodily fluids, and slimy bugs, and so on, even that is based on self-deception. You're trying to convince yourself you're above all that. Even though that probably doesn't do very much harm, it's worth noting that it's still based on a kind of falsehood you're telling to yourself. Oh, that's not part of me. Let me get rid of that. I'm not really an animal. But then what's worse is that in all known societies, and we've done some cross-cultural research on that with our center in New Delhi, people learn to feel disgust at other groups of people who in that society stand in for animals, so to speak, because it's not enough to keep yourself clean away from feces and bodily dirt and so on. But people need a further buffer zone, so to speak, and then they fasten on a group of humans. And they can say about these humans, oh, those are the animals. And if I separate myself from those, then I'm that much further from being animal and mortal myself. Now, in every society, there are some such groups. They're always different, and the shape of the disgust fantasy is different. So that was why the cross-cultural work with India was so interesting. The Indian caste hierarchy teaches people that members of the lowest castes, who typically are selected for that because they dispose of wastes and they sweep the floor and so on, that those are the animals, and you must not touch them. You must not allow them into your kitchen. Any food that's been touched by them is polluted, and so on. Now, we compared that with racial disgust directed at African Americans in the history of the US. And it's fascinating to see that some of the themes are constant, namely, oh, those are based animals. We shouldn't really touch them. We shouldn't let them swim in the same swimming pool. We shouldn't let them drink from the same water supply. But there's some big differences because, for example, in the Old South, an African-American woman often did cook food for the whole family. The family had no objection to that. Whereas in India, that would be the worst thing, for a Dalit to cook food in your kitchen. So all these things are so irrational that once you put them side by side, you see the complete irrationality of it. But of course, they focus on not sharing water, not sharing sex, of course, and in general, just not having enough contact with those animals. Now, those are two examples of that, but there are others. I think in most cultures, women are treated as more animal than the male because they're connected with giving birth, and so they're thought to be, as it were, the body of the male. The male can be sort of like an angel with no body, but the woman, because she gives birth, she's the body. And so people learn to feel disgust at women's menstrual periods, at their birth experiences, and at other aspects of women's bodies. In my book, The Monarchy of Fear, I have a whole list of statements about women made by Donald Trump that illustrate this fact. He has a particular preoccupation with disgust at women's bodies. So if a woman was having a menstrual period, if she was about to get up and go to the bathroom, he would make some remark, oh, that's so disgusting. So anyway, these forms of disgust are extremely dangerous and damaging for society. And they're not necessary. They're all learned. I mean, if somebody didn't grow up in that culture, they think this is a very bizarre formation. But the question is, can we unlearn them enough? Now, we probably can't get rid of the first, what I call primary object disgust at bodily waste products, because it's probably ingrained in our evolutionary endowment. And maybe it's even useful sometimes because it steers us away from things that are really dangerous. Like if the milk smells disgusting, you probably had better not drink it. It's a good guide to things that are really dangerous. But as I say, even that kind of disgust is dangerous because it spreads the view that animality is itself disgusting. So all of that could stay, but we would have to be on guard. But what I call projective disgust, when you project it onto a group of people, that's always bad. There should be no such thing in any society. Can it happen? Could we ever find a society that had no projective disgust? Well, not yet. It migrates. If it's not a racial subgroup, it might be sexual subgroup. Feeling disgust at transgender people, for example, is a big thing in the United States today. But we can work on that. And I think we could, it's certainly thinkable that we could lose completely projective disgust. Another thing that I think is thinkable that we could lose without losing the others is the retributive kind of anger. Now, anger is very complicated. It contains more than one thought. It contains the thought, that thing that that damage that happened was wrong and it should not have happened. But it also contains, and this is what every philosopher who defines anger in both India and the United States has said, it contains the thought there should be a payback. The person who did that should pay for what he or she has done. So the thought of retribution comes in. Now, I think that when you're angry, the retributive part is actually very damaging and very useless. It just makes you turn to the past, not to the future. It makes you focus on destroying the person who did that to you rather than having a better world in the future. If you think about capital punishment, for example, very popular in the United States, and it's popular despite the fact that we know from countless experiments that it does no good. It does not stop people from killing. But people cling to it. If their child has been murdered, they think, oh, now I better make sure that that killer gets killed. And sometimes people get very obsessed with that, and they really devote their whole lives to making sure that that killer gets capital punishment. But what good does that do? It doesn't do any good. And what they really want is that their child should come back. And of course, that's not possible. But what might be possible would be for them to do something to help other children or to prevent other murders in the future. The group called Mothers Against Drunk Driving has done a lot to stop people from driving when they're drunk. So even though those people don't get their children back, there are a lot of other children that don't get killed. So that's constructive and it's future directed. But the kind that turns to the past and says, let's get rid of that killer, that's no use at all. I think again about getting a divorce. When you get a divorce, it's very, very tempting to think that what that process should all be about is destroying the person who hurt you. You want that person to suffer. How do you make them suffer? Well, often it's by trying to get a punitive financial settlement in the divorce court. But really, that doesn't do any good for you. It really doesn't help you move forward. It doesn't help your self-respect. It doesn't help you become happy again. And then you get focused on the past, and you devote all your thinking to that person who hurt you in the past. And it often does great damage to your family, to your children. So again, that retributive type of anger, that retributive part of anger is actually very destructive. So what I think is we could get rid of that part and still keep the other part that says this is wrong and it should not happen again. I give this the name transition anger because it makes a transition to face the future. It says, well, that was bad, but let's make sure that that doesn't happen again in the future. Martin Luther King Jr. had the same idea. He actually made the same distinction that I make, and he says that there's one way you could get angry at, let's say, racial discrimination, and that way would be just to try to inflict pain on the people who caused it. And King said, that's not very helpful, and it's confused, it's not even radical, because for it to be radical, it has to do something that's useful. And so he said when people came to his movement, their anger had to be, as he put it, purified, meaning it had to lose that retributive part. And what it would keep is the spirit of justified protest and the determination to make a world that's better in the future. But then, of course, the person who says that's wrong, it had better not happen again, had better also have some other emotions such as hope that it can be made better and faith that people will join in making it better and so on. So that's what King was trying to build in his movement. I think that's possible. It's something that people have said in many times and places. Buddhist thinkers in all eras have been against the retributive kind of anger. Gandhi also, although he wasn't a Buddhist, he agreed with the Buddhists in thinking retributive anger is very damaging. So we can get rid of the retributive part and still retain, as Gandhi of course always did, the spirit of determined protest against wrongdoing. And when Gandhi led people on a march. He didn't say, let's go and destroy these British people. No, he says, he gave them images of hope and of building. He had them sing songs by the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore that were songs about how you must keep walking, walking on, walking alone until you're able to create something better. So I do think that that's one place where the Greeks and Romans went a little bit wrong, because I do think we can get rid of the retributive kind of anger and keep the good aspect of anger, which is recognizing wrongdoing, saying that's not tolerable, we don't want to have that in the future, and then combining the part of anger that's left, the purified part, with other emotions such as hope and faith to build a better future.
So both when it comes to the retributive part of anger, and also very fascinatingly in your description of projective disgust, you think that change is possible. But then there's the question of what form should or must the therapy take? Because at one extreme, for instance, you have someone like me reading your analysis of projective disgust and being fascinated and perhaps starting to wonder about my reactions of anger and disgust and so on. But how far does that get one? So what would be the forms of therapy in this case? How do you envisage this?
Well, I think it has to happen at all levels of society. Of course, one part that's very important to me is law. If law gives same-sex couples the right to marry, then immediately they're positioned alongside straight couples. They're not positioned in a lower level of animality as they were in previous eras of law. So law is a very important part of it. But I also think that informal social movements are extremely important. If you look at how the gay rights movement has actually proceeded, they try to stimulate images of love and inclusion. Just now we're beginning, June is Gay Pride Month, and for the very first time, the whole city of Chicago will have the rainbow flag flown all through the month of June. And that flag symbolizes joy and unity and togetherness. And I think people who I grew up thinking, I was taught to think that gay people were disgusting. And of course, what happened to me was that I became a professional actress and I met a lot of gay people. And I learned just firsthand that they were very nice and usually much better than a lot of the straight men who were bound to sexual abuse of women and so forth. So I learned through friendship not to have those views, but people don't always have that opportunity. So I think if they grow up seeing the rainbow flag and they think, oh, that's an image of togetherness, we must grow together with people who've suffered from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, that's another way to do it. And, you know, the worse the discrimination is, the more different places you need to work on it in, if you see what I mean. I think in the United States, racial discrimination is the most enduring, and it's just been taught to us for so long. I grew up, my father was from the Deep South, and he tried to bring me up to think that African Americans were disgusting and you shouldn't go near them and so. Well, I learned through friendship because I was in a theater company. The theater is a great crucible of togetherness because, you know, no one has a job and you're trying to put on some play together and no opportunity to be so full of disgust. And in a way, theater validates the body. And I think all disgust has its root in hatred of the body. But if you're an actor, the chances are you learn not to hate the body so much. But in most of society, people still have a lot of racial reactions. And, you know, we are fighting this terrible struggle about racism and policing. So there you have to fight on the grounds of law. A lot of my colleagues who work on criminal law are working on policing and the reform of policing. Actually, our mayor, who's trying to work on this, she's a graduate of our law school. So that's one end of it, and just working on the education of police, but also working on the family. What what are parents telling their children about this? And of course, this is a political struggle too, because right now the Republicans are trying to say, in school you must not teach that racism is systematically woven into the fabric of American culture. Well, of course, that's bizarre because it's true. And why would you tell school teachers not to teach something that's true? But we got to fight about that, and we have to make sure the teachers get to say what they believe and what is true, so that children understand that this is not just a couple of bad people who are racist, but it's part of the fabric of our society. The family is enormously important. How do we learn not to have retributive anger? Well, that's mainly in the family, because your parents usually don't say, oh, now you've done something wrong, you're going to pay for what you've done. That's what parents used to say maybe 100 years ago, but they don't say that now. Now they say, well, you've done something that's wrong, and I think it's pretty outrageous. But what we need to figure out is how you cannot do that again. What is a better way forward for you? And they choose, of course, punishment can be a part of this, but punishment that's not retributive, but that's oriented toward reform and deterrence. So they usually would say to their child, well, now you have to go without some nice thing that you otherwise would like to have because you've done this outrageous thing, and that's in order to teach you not to have that kind of anger going forward. So, parents have learned that over the years. How did parents learn that? I think it's really because they read the books of Dr. Benjamin Spock. I was in the first generation where parents were told not to hit your child. And before that, they always did think, oh, if your child does something bad, you hit the child and that's payback. But I was brought up to think you use punishment as a kind of forward-directed reform, and it's gentle. So, that changed really just because of one person, Dr. Spock, whose books were read by every parent. But so we just have to think, where are the sites where I can make a difference? And each person is situated differently. Some people are parents and they can make a difference in that way. Some are teachers, they can make a difference in that way. Some are involved with writing about law and they can make a difference in that way. Some are administering law and that's where they make the difference. But for each emotion, each person has to figure out, well, where am I situated and what can I do to make our overall situation better? And I think that means they need a kind of guidance. What I tried to provide in The Monarchy of Fear was a kind of map of the emotions for struggling American society to say, here's what you have to beware of, here's what you might want to cultivate, but then to cultivate it, what do you do, where are you, what difference can you make, and so on. And I really just think it's like that it's all very contextual and it's all very particular.
Exactly. Now, in looking at your work and reading various texts next to each other, I'm wondering if it's true to say that there has been any kind of course, a development in the sense that you go on investigating from new angles, new emotions, etc. But when it comes to anger in particular, I'm wondering if you used to be more see it as not unproblematic, but as, for instance, as justified anger. You would have this in your list of capabilities, and you would take the sort of Aristotelian take that anger is all in all a productive and positive emotion, whereas I sense perhaps that you're thinking now that anger is more deeply problematic than that. I mean, the classical notion of anger, is that right?
Absolutely. Well, I love to change my mind. I guess, some people, when they get to my age, they try to dig in and defend their views at all costs. But I think if you're doing that, you're basically dead. If you're not capable of listening to the criticism, whether it's from other people or from your own head, and moving and changing, then you might as well stop doing it. You've done it already. You're not changing. And I have, in fact, changed my views about quite a few things. I've changed particularly, as you mentioned, the view on anger. Not all anger, but the retributive part of anger. that was really not so much from getting criticism from others, because what I'm saying, actually, there are not too many people who agree with me, only the Buddhists and a few others. In American philosophy, most people like retribution, I'm afraid. They're just part of that culture. But anyway, I was just sitting and thinking about anger because I was determined to write my Locke lectures on that topic, anger and forgiveness. And initially, as you say, in my earlier books, I had defended the Aristotelian view that what's wrong is the excess, but the emotion itself, including the retributive part, is perfectly okay if it's kept within bounds. But then I started taking the emotion apart, and I remember just sitting in my office thinking, well, now this retributive part that they all seem to think is there, what's the function of that? What good does that do? And I think it's fair to say that I was already on the track of that. I never liked capital punishment. I always thought that it was stupid for people to dig in and try to just get somebody killed for the sake of payback. And I have to say, in personal relationships too, I've always thought that if you get divorced from somebody, it's really stupid to devote your life to punishing that person. And I'm kind of known among my friends from having very friendly and affectionate relationships with people that I've broken up with. And why not? I mean, they're good people. If you can't live with somebody, that doesn't mean they're not a good person. You might actually enjoy the relationship better when you don't have to figure out how to live with them. And I've often found that. So anyway, I was on the track of that, but I didn't yet get there until I just sat all by myself and thought, what on earth good does that do? I hadn't even read the parts of King's essays where he talked about that, so I did that later. But anyway, I came to that conclusion. It is an ingredient in most anger, that retributive element. Not all anger, but most anger. But it's an ingredient that really does no good. There are other things that I've changed my mind about. The whole topic of national and international cosmopolitanism, so-called. I used to think that our first attachment must be to humanity as a whole, and our attachment to our own nation has to be derivative from that. And I actually changed my view about that for reasons that had to do with other philosophers that I studied. Hugo Grotius, a 17th century Dutch philosopher, he made the very good case that the nation is the largest unit that we know that's capable of being a vehicle for people's own autonomy and being accountable to their voices. So the international sphere, if it's going to get to anything good, has to go through the nation. And patriotism directed at the good qualities of the nation, not, of course, every version of patriotism, but the patriotism devoted to good ideals of the nation, has a very important role to play. And there, I have to say, unfortunately, the earlier view was written in a very popular essay that gets reprinted again and again and again. And whenever they ask my permission to do a reprint, I say, you can't reprint it unless you include a footnote saying my views have changed. But most people don't ask permission, so I turn up at some place and people say, oh, all the students have been asked to read your essay on patriotism and cosmopolitanism. And I say, well, actually, I don't believe that anymore. So we go through that, and it's just so annoying to me to find that it's less than 10 pages, about a 5-page essay. People know that more than they know all the more extended arguments that where I've tried to explain why I don't believe that anymore. There's an American politician named Josh Hawley who quotes me. He says Nussbaum is the leader of the cosmopolitan elite. And, he correctly quotes this one short article that I wrote in 1994. I can't complain about that. And I don't actually expect a politician to read my subsequent books. But when a graduate student writes a dissertation that says Nussbaum is the leader of the cosmopolitans, then I do blame that person and the thesis advisor, because they should have read my subsequent books. So anyway, that's a case where people don't really know about the change. And the case of anger, I think people, fortunately, I find people do know about that, and it's gotten around, so to speak, so that they do think that I'm a weirdo, but they think that I've changed. The changed view is the one that they associate with me.
Exactly. Now, turning to another area where you have done very important work, but at the same time keeping some continuity, does your work on the capabilities approach have anything to do with your change of mind when it comes to cosmopolitanism and nation states? Because in the capabilities approach, it's very important to on a sort of practical level to know who to hold responsible. Is there a connection there?
Well, I think not really, because the capabilities approach is a general approach, and different people who use the approach understand it in different ways. And I myself had the approach before I came to this view about cosmopolitanism and nationalism. But as you say, because you actually have to implement it, in my version, it's a template for constitution making. You had to focus on nations because there is no such thing as a world constitution, nor I think should there be really, but that's a separate point. So indeed, on the practical level, it had to be very nation focused because a nation has the job of spelling out the basic entitlements and rights of its citizens. And what the capabilities approach says is a way of doing that that's very useful is to think what each person in very important areas of life should be able to do and to be. Now, of course, that's very broad and general, but I think I would connect it to what I say about the emotions in the following way. We're all vulnerable. We have many things to fear, many things to love and long for. But what are the forms of vulnerability that a decent society would remove? And that's how the capabilities approach is related to the emotions work. Because I think, we should not glorify vulnerability. Some forms of vulnerability are actually valuable. Namely, when you make yourself vulnerable by loving somebody and you open yourself to the influence of that other person, that's a chosen form of vulnerability that's actually valuable. And society should protect that. The choice to have a child, which is one of the things that makes you most vulnerable in the world. Again, that's a valuable form of vulnerability, and society should protect that choice. But there are other things, like being hungry, being a victim of sexual assault, being lacking health insurance. There are many other such things. No decent society would allow those things. And the flip side of that is that every decent society would have a list of basic entitlements of all citizens that ought to include not being subject to sexual assault, not being hungry, having decent health care, having various protected areas of choice and freedom, such as the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, and freedom of choice about marriage and childbirth. So if we put those all together, we get pretty much my list of the capabilities. And I won't go into the whole list, but in any case, I think it's a good list, but it could always be made better, and I hope over time it will be made better. And actually, many constitutions in the world today have something like that list. I focused particularly in thinking about it on the Constitution of South Africa and the Constitution of India. The US, unfortunately, does not have social and economic rights in its constitution. So we have no constitutional right to health care, no constitutional right to bodily integrity and protection from rape and assault and so on. So, we get there in different ways by statutory law and by reading things into other parts of the Constitution. But it's fair to say that we don't do what most nations in Europe do, and indeed what India and South Africa do, that is giving constitutional status to material and social rights. So I'm thinking of that as part, and then of course the more traditional part, the freedom of speech, the right to vote and so on, that would be the political part. And yeah, all of this ought to be set down in the constitution of a nation. Internationally, we can certainly try to help one another as nations realize those rights. But again, I've realized over the years that that's not so easy for the following reason. I used to think that if nations that are rich only decided they're going to give 2% of GDP to the developing nations, then that would start to correct this imbalance and people would have better health care and so on and so on. But the fact is that good empirical work by economists, particularly Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2004, I think it was 2000, maybe it was later, but anyway, Angus Deaton has shown that foreign aid is more often than not counterproductive. If you just float a lot of cash into India, what's going to happen? Not the building of a durable health infrastructure. Instead, they'll think, oh, well, the rich countries are going to give us this money, so we don't need to do it ourselves. And therefore, it creates a disincentive to create a durable health infrastructure in that nation itself. Deaton did this by empirical work that compared different Indian states. He worked primarily on health, but I think it's true for lots of things. Probably not quite so true for education. If you go in and you set up a good school, well, at least the school is there. But for the most part, if it's going to work for people, it's got to be done by the people. And therefore, the people the governments that are accountable to people had better kick in and do it. And Deaton has done comparative work on the different Indian states, and he's shown they have very different records on health and on bodily integrity, women's liberty, and so on, depending on the kind of government that they've been able to elect over time. But if you just give them a whole pile of cash, then they don't need to elect that government anymore. So there's a real problem about foreign aid. And I mean, there are other problems too. It's often paternalistic. It says, oh, we know what India needs, and we're going to give you money to fix your primitive society. So that's bad too. But even when the money is given for just the purposes that Indians themselves ask, it's likely to make things worse. And that's really tough, because I think most well-intentioned people in richer countries would like to help alleviate the poverty and illness in the rest of the world. So what can we do? Now, actually, we do have a center in New Delhi, our university. We have a lot of cooperative projects. And I think one thing that we can do to help developing countries in ways that they appreciate and that they're asking for is scholarly cooperation. So we have projects in medicine and health, projects in preserving film archives. I mean, you name it. I had a big project on Disgust that I mentioned before. But that requires partnership with scholars in India, and they're equal partners in the project. We learn from them, they learn from us. And of course, the funding is pretty minimal. It's not like throwing a lot of cash at the problem. It's just giving them intellectual stimulation and advice. But also, technology transfer can be very useful if we have particular skills in preserving films, let's say. We can help Indian film archives learn that technology. If we have library resources, which we actually do, that Indian libraries either don't have or haven't preserved, we can help them with that preservation. So technology transfer is a very good way of helping another country. But again, it has to be in a way that that country actually wants and asks for.
Exactly, but turning back then to the core of your capabilities approach, it's of course interesting that it's capabilities and not just capability, but and also the focus on the individuals here. But I'm wondering if you could say something more about what is common among these 10 broadly defined capabilities. There is at the heart of it some kind of a notion of dignity. Could you say something more about this? Because at least in the traditions that I know, you have the Kantian idea of dignity as being very much a sort of intellectual sort of thing. So your dignity stems really from your ability to universalize and make a law for yourself. It's that kind of thing. But that can't be your notion of dignity.
Okay, first of all, the plural and the singular. I use the word capabilities all the time because I want to emphasize that these 10 are different. They're not commensurable with one another. You can't trade one off against the other. But, you know, Amartya Sen, my great collaborator, usually uses the singular because he's still within vaguely the utilitarian framework, and he still does think in terms of trade-offs at times. So they're different views. And this whole association that we created, the Human Development and Capability Association, I'm afraid to say, there are two things in that name that I don't like, the singular and the human, because I think this is an approach that also is a very important way of thinking about the rights of non-human animals. And there, I really think it's misleading, because there are a lot of people in our association that agree with me. There are also a lot that vehemently disagree with me. But we should say, I don't know, the Development and Capabilities Association is what I would prefer. But yes, dignity. The reason I wanted to think about that is, if you try to think intuitively, what are the things that belong on the list? Well, you can't poll people and say, what do you value? And Amartya thinks you do it by democratic deliberation, but he's a fan of democracy, and I'm not such a great fan. I mean, I'm a fan of democracy as better than not democracy, but I think constitutions are important because they hold certain very important things fixed that democratic majorities might want to take away. And I think the democratic majority in India right now wants to take away a lot of things, like the freedom of religion, for example, which is being taken away as we speak by the various legislation that Narendra Modi has put into play. But it's also true of the US that there are things that majorities want that they shouldn't put into place. So I think that constitutions are, in a sense, they're a counter-majoritarian part of democracy. Now, what makes something belong on the list then can't be that the majority wants it. That's just not enough. And I think one good way of thinking about it is, if you think of a life without that, it's a life that's not worthy of the dignity, well, let's say first, of a human being. So if you think of a life that women are forced to lead when they don't have protection for their bodily integrity, there are no laws protecting women from rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, that's a life that's not worthy of the dignity of women. And I think we can kind of see that intuitively, that it involves a kind of humiliation and subjugation. Now, it's not the Kantian notion of dignity exactly, but what it has in common with the Kantian notion is we're saying this is a being that ought to be treated as an end, not as a means to the ends of other people. Women have all too long been treated as mere means or servants of men, as helpmates and helpers of men. And what we're saying is that no, they're ends in themselves and equal ends in themselves. So that's the common feature with Kant. But the difference, the biggest difference is that, of course, I think that human beings are not the only ones who have dignity. Now, there are Kantians who disagree with Kant on this. The philosopher Christine Korsgaard, wonderful philosopher who actually was a former student of mine, she has written a wonderful book about animals, and she is a Kantian. But she doesn't like Kant's views about animals. So she says we can keep the idea of the end in itself and not being mere property, but we just have to say it belongs to all sentient beings. And I think that's right. But of course, it has to be the kind of dignity that is appropriate to that kind of creature. So the kind of dignity that the human being demands might require, let's say, openness to university education, and that would be something that wouldn't be of such interest to an elephant. But there are other things that are of interest to the dignity of that elephant, namely having a group of female elephants that cooperate together. And that dignity is violated by every zoo in the world. They take the elephant and put it in a separate place. It can't communicate with its own group. And that is an indignity, and it's a humiliation of that elephant. So in short, you have to know the form of life of the creature, and you have to know what the dignity of that creature requires, and what is, I mean, of course, if you think about elephants and you care about them, as I do, you can right away see that this elephant in a little cage that has no other elephants around it, and it can't walk across miles and miles of terrain, as most elephants do in an average day. That is a humiliated elephant. It's an elephant robbed of its dignity. Now, of course, it still has inherent dignity, but the life that it's been given is not worthy of the inherent dignity of that creature. So that's what we have to do for each creature, but then that means we have to know what these creatures do, what they care about, what they take pride in, what they really love. And of course, that's what science is doing very, very much today. We know so much more about all these creatures. So we know now that, for example, orcas, known as killer whales, that were shown in theme parks, now there have been studies and one popular film called Blackfish that show that when that orca is kidnapped when it's a baby and ripped away from its group, it not only is miserable, and of course it's taught to play tricks for humans, it's not only miserable and humiliated, but it forms pathological desires, and it eventually is going to probably kill somebody. But that's because its dignity has been insulted and it's been given a life that's not worthy of its dignity. So anyway, that's the part that Kant would not agree with, but I think Kant was just wrong about that.
So I see one very important feature of this capabilities approach is that in one way it should be minimal, because it shouldn't depend very broadly on a given tradition or a comprehensive view of the good. So ideally it should be that kind of theory, but just a question just to ask about the relationship between your theory of emotions and your capabilities approach. Is one way of spelling out the idea of dignity to somehow say that it's the sort of thing that we can elaborate in terms of emotions, so that a being that doesn't have any emotions, any kind of doesn't form a kind of experiential center in that way, would not be a relevant kind of species?
That's interesting. Well, the first thing you said, I just want to elaborate on a little bit. I do think that this is a political view, the capabilities view, and therefore it should be a partial view of the good for political purposes, not a thoroughly comprehensive view, because we want people who hold different religions and different ethical views to be able to accept it. So that's where I agree with John Rawls's political liberalism. But, well, the thing is, what about those Stoics who reject the emotions? I actually think that our society ought to include such people. I don't agree with them, but I think they're not doing anyone any real harm. So you see, that's why the list is a list of capabilities. Now, the Stoics don't have to use the emotional capabilities. On my list is the ability to have emotions and so on and so on. But if the Stoics think, I don't want that in my life, I want the life of solitary Stoic dignity, I think they're not going to be totally rejected. It's not as though they're evil, racist people and so forth. They can accept my list as a list of capabilities, and they'll just say, I'm not going to use those. I don't think so much of those. It's sort of like if people don't like religion. They're determined not to have anything to do with religion, and yet they notice that the freedom of religion is actually a pretty important thing that their citizens think ought to be protected. Well, I know many such people, and they certainly don't think we should take the freedom of religion out of the Constitution, but they're not going to use it. They just don't want to have anything to do with it. And I guess I think the Stoics could be like that. That is, they're going to look at a lot of the things on the list and they're going to say, well, either I'm not going to use that at all, or I'm going to use it in a different, more internalized way. But it's okay with me. They have the opportunity. They don't want to use it. They don't have to use it. So therefore, how do the emotions play a role? Well, I do think, as I said, the emotions are one part of the list. One thing that people need, and I think it should be constitutionally protected, is the opportunity to cultivate and manifest a whole range of emotions. Now, doesn't that sound weird? How could one have a law that did that? Well, I think you can think about what's not that, and then you can see from there, you can work toward what the positive side would be. When people live in fear, and when the structure of the society makes them feel, I have to have fear every time I drive a car that I get pulled over and shot, that's not fulfilling my emotional capability. They don't have the chance to have reasonable fear. And so they're made to live in terrible fear. The same thing, of course, has happened to women when they don't have protection against domestic violence, where they don't have anywhere to turn, and we're only just beginning to have laws that are adequate to that. So I think that's the connection, that people in a bad and an unjust society are made to have insecure and excessive or deformed emotions, excessive fear and excessive, unprotected vulnerability. Whereas in a just society, they would certainly have some fear, because anytime you love somebody, you're going to have some fear. So unless you're one of those Stoics, you're going to have plenty of fear in your life, but not the kind that you would have. And I remember when I was in college, I got raped 2 times. I was sexually harassed frequently. That was the kind of fear that women should not face. And of course, by now, it is included as part of laws that have constitutional status. Sexual harassment was actually brought in out of a statutory law, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but Supreme Court cases have given it constitutional standing now. So anyway, that's a kind of fear. Well, you might still have it, but now you know where to turn and who to go to. And the law is on your side, not on the other person's side. So that's the way the emotions work. And if you think about anger, what I said about anger, I do think that people should have strong support for their outrage, their transition anger kind of anger. That is to say, if somebody does something outrageous to them, then the law should be on their side. They should have someone to complain to, and they shouldn't be told, oh, forget about that, you don't count. But the retributive part, I don't think they should have a right to. When people say, oh, capital punishment is part of my right, well, we have these arguments all the time, because capital punishment was first declared unconstitutional, and then it was brought back in, and it goes back and forth all the time. I think there's ample reason to think that it can't be administered fairly, and that for that reason alone, it should be unconstitutional. But I also think that it's just a non-starter in terms of the emotion views that I hold. So I think we shouldn't just throw it out because it can't be fairly administered, but I'd be pretty happy if we just did that. And we did do that for a while, but then it came back in again. So anyway, each emotion is connected to areas of law where people need protection, they need help. Just think about the love for children. Now, there are lots of things that people want when they love their children. First of all, of course, they want their choice to have a child to be permitted by the society. I think countries that regulate procreation, there's a real problem with that in my view. But they also want the child to be protected by decent health care, decent educational system, decent job opportunities. And in my country, that is not yet a reality. So there's a lot of unreasonable meaning it shouldn't be there, fear for children if you have a child that just shouldn't be there. If there was a decent healthcare system, that would go a long way to eradicating many people's terrible fear. And it is really just so ridiculous that a country of our sort, where there's such advanced medical care available, somebody without employer-based insurance has a really terrible time. I spent this year, after my daughter died, because my son-in-law was insured through my daughter's work-based insurance, I spent a lot of time in this past year getting insurance for him off of the marketplace. And I can tell you, it's very difficult, and the options are not very good. You end up paying a great deal of money anyway. So I'm just hoping that we get something better from Biden, and I know he certainly wants to do it, but we have to see whether he can.
Yes, these terrible things that you're describing, they I guess they also show somehow that not only is this a work on vulnerability that you do, but it also shows that transforming that vulnerability again is something that one can do for oneself, only to a limited extent. There's no simple fix for any of this.
No. Of course, we are all mortal, and yet there's so many differences between the lifespan of more privileged people and the lifespan of less privileged people. And of course, we would all like to live as long as we possibly could, and that means being entitled to really, really good health care. But right now, that just isn't the reality for a lot of people in the U.S. And, even the kind that you buy off of the insurance marketplace, thank goodness Obama put that in. But that, as I say, it costs quite a lot of money. And so if you have money, you can get it, and it's not very good, and it's not very reliable. But it's better than not being able to get it. So yeah, so the vulnerability persists, and we're all vulnerable. But there's other kinds of vulnerability. What about employment-related vulnerability? I have tenure in the University of Chicago, so I'm extremely lucky. Even during COVID, I could not be fired. All our salaries were frozen, so I didn't get a raise, but good heavens, that's a tiny thing. And the other thing is that I couldn't have my health insurance taken away because it was part of my employment. So I was just pretty fine, even in a time of terrible national distress. But many people, and another thing, by the way, that I am 74 years old, most people my age all over the world have already been forced into retirement. I think one of the great injustices of our era is compulsory retirement by age, and I've written about that. My friend Saul Levmore and I wrote a book about aging. I think, everyone thinks discrimination on grounds of race, gender, sexual orientation, that's very, very bad. Not enough people think about discrimination on grounds of age. And let me tell you, all my friends who teach in Europe and who teach in India have been forced into retirement. It's not good for their work, because they're still very active, as am I. It's not good for their mental health, because they don't have people to talk to. They can't come into the office anymore. No one wants them there. They often have to give up university housing and move far away. They're isolated. So, this is very bad. And everyone says, we need to do that to make room for the young. I don't believe that, because I think that I'm a voice for the humanities. Everywhere I go, I say we must have young humanists hired. I've gotten a certain eminence, and I can use it for a good cause. And if you force the people who are eminent out of their job, then they can't do anything good for other people. That's what my answer to that objection is. And, I'm doing a lot of things to make the humanities grow. So it's not a static state. I hope that my books make more people buy books in philosophy. I hope that my teaching makes more people major in philosophy. And of course, your whole system is different, but we have a liberal arts system where you don't choose your major subject until your end of your second year. We have more philosophy majors than English majors, history majors, and quite a few other subjects, just because we all do a really good job of teaching. We care about teaching, and we invest in that. And so to tell the people who are invested in it, oh, goodbye, go away, because now you're over 65, that seems to me a terrible thing. So anyway, that's a detour from where we were, but I just wanted to register that point, that I'm more secure than philosophers in virtually any country. I think England is starting to remove compulsory retirement, but very unevenly. But in most places, a philosopher of my age would be out on the dust heap already. So anyway, I'm very, very secure. And yet, of course, I'm afraid of diseases, I'm afraid of COVID, and I'm afraid of somebody I love falling ill and all of that. So we're all vulnerable, but the idea is to think, what are the forms of vulnerability that a decent society would be ashamed to allow its citizens to suffer, and then to protect those beyond majority vote, because majorities are extremely unreliable.
When it comes to your ongoing work, I mean, we've seen, many of your projects really are things that have gone on over decades, developing and deepening and transforming. And so what are your sort of ongoing and future, and anything in particular that you'd like to highlight of projects that you have upcoming?
Well, I just had a new book that came out in May, and so your audience may not know it yet, about sexual assault and sexual harassment. And that was a more popular book in order to lay out some of the issues in law and culture. And not surprisingly, I defend a strong role for law, but I also object to retribution and so on. But the book that I'm writing right now, and I'm supposed to finish by December if I can, is a book I've been working on for quite a long time about animal rights. So we've already talked about that a little. In my book, Frontiers of Justice, I did have a kind of brief essay on how the capabilities approach could be used to defend basic rights for animals. But this is a big book where I really do this in a thoroughgoing way. I lay out the approaches that others have used, why I don't think that they're fully adequate. I talk about the utilitarian approach, about Christine Korsgaard's Kantian approach, but then I develop my form of the capabilities approach, and I use a lot of recent scientific research to talk about the cognitive capacities of animals of many kinds, the emotional capacities of animals of many kinds, and I face the question, where's the cutoff? Which creatures are sentient in my sense? Should plants have entitlements? I say no to that, but I'm sure people will argue against me on that. And then I look more closely at different types of animals, companion animals. What should law do to apply the capabilities approach in the case of dogs and cats, animals we live with? Then wild animals, should we just try to leave them alone? I say no to that. I say we're there already, so we better try to make that place a better habitat than we're now making it for animals of many kinds. And then I go on to really look in detail about the role of both domestic and international law. So that's the current book, and I'm really excited about it. Then when that's done, of course, I'll keep on promoting it and doing interviews on it and so forth. There are two books that I have actually under contract, and both are about music. Now, I talked about music and its relationship to my view of emotions in Upheavals of Thought, because to me, music is very important, and the way that music shapes and expresses emotion is a very interesting topic. And of course, I talk about classical music because that's what I know about. But in any case, the two books that are due or that are under contract, one is about Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. I had written a long article on that that's already appeared in a volume, War in Law and Literature, that my colleagues and I edited. But then it was suggested to me that if I just make it about double the length, I could have a small monograph on the whole War Requiem. So instead of just talking about certain parts of it, I want to try to talk about each major segment of it. And basically, I'm trying to ask what a work of music can do that maybe words by themselves can't do so well, to make us understand the brutality of war, the impact of war on the vulnerable body, and why we should care about the vulnerable body. What's beautiful and lovable about the body? I mean, all of these things are things I think Britain is doing in this work. So I try to spell that out, making use of Schopenhauer's theory of musical emotion and so on. And then another book is a much larger book about opera. I'm a huge opera fan. For many years, I've been writing program notes for the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And I teach a regular course with the CEO and General Director of Lyric Opera of Chicago, Anthony Freund, a course on opera, where not just music students, but believe me, and not just philosophy students, but law students are studying opera. It's so much fun because there are people of so many different kinds that learn to love opera, that love it already, and so on. And I talk about sort of the ideas in the operas, not just in the libretto, of course, but the ideas expressed by the music, whether they're in the libretto or not. And he talks about the production values, and so it's a fun course. And this has led me to want to write a book, and it's called The Republic of Love, Opera, Breath, and Freedom. Now, you'll recognize that that means it's a kind of antitype to the monarchy of fear. Opera has a connection, historically, with the rise of Republican self-government. Mozart in particular. So Mozart is kind of the center. The first half is all about the Mozart operas. Mozart was a dedicated Freemason who believed in equality, brotherhood, and Republican self-government. And he put all this into his operas, not only the Magic Flute, where people recognize that it's there, but in quite a lot of other places. Dedicated opposition to people being ruled by superstitious fear and religious tyranny, and a dedicated love of equality and reciprocity, a dedicated opposition to the tyranny of men over women. That's a part that's, I think, especially important for Mozart. So anyway, this section of the book will have various chapters on the different Mozart operas, spelling out those themes. And then I say in the second half, well, what are the parts of that project, if you will, the Mozartian project of building a republic of love, the Freemason project? What parts did Mozart not really understand? What problems in the way of that project did he not really understand? Well, first, he never, being a very gentle and tender person, he didn't fully understand the brutality of dictatorship and what it can do to the human body. So then I turn to Beethoven's Fidelio, and I say, here we have a further continuation of the Mozartian project. He didn't understand the depth to which religious fear and superstition infect people who might have been Republican citizens. And here I turn to Verdi and to Don Carlos for that idea. I mean, Verdi was a very determined Republican, but he also knew that religion could get its claws into people. And Don Carlos shows people being willing to put to death the envoys from Flanders who were Republicans just because the Inquisition tells them to. So that's another continuation of the Mozartian project, studying those further problems. I think Mozart didn't fully understand the extent to which men's tyranny over women was woven into the social fabric and really destroys women. And although this is going to be controversial, I do think that Madama Butterfly, which is often reviled as being sexist, I think it's just the opposite. I think it's the most scathing portrayal of American sexism and hierarchy that there has been in opera. And the woman is its victim in a way, but she expresses the good kind of vulnerability, namely the choice to love in spite of all the difficulties. And then the last chapter, I go back to Benjamin Britten again. I do think Benjamin Britten is the greatest composer of opera in the 20th century. And Britten, being a gay man in England whose sex acts were not legal until, 9 years before his death, because he died in 76, and sodomy was decriminalized in Britain in 1967. He was an outsider throughout his whole life. He was lucky to find deep love, and he wrote most of his works for, or gave a crucial role in, to the man he loved, Peter Pears, the singer. So he had love in his life, and it's a very good thing that when he did die, Queen Elizabeth was willing to write a letter of consolation to Peter Pears as though to a grieving spouse. I think Queen Elizabeth was actually an opera fan, and she understood that the arts can point the way ahead to where society has not been ready to go. But anyway, Britten was always in favor of the outcast. When he was a boy, he was actually thrown out of school for writing an essay on animal rights. He wrote saying that hunting for sport should be banned, and the school thought that was so bad that they wouldn't let him graduate. So all through, he was against the rejection of the body that he saw all around him, and he wanted to defend the vulnerable body and its pleasures. In any case, I'm going to study several of his operas, particularly Peter Grimes, the great opera of the outcast, Billy Budd, which again talks about the terrible role of pent-up self-hatred in bringing Billy Claggart is really a case of a self-hating gay man who wants to inflict pain on other people. And, of course, then I do think Britten actually had fun sometimes, so I want to talk about the opera Albert Herring, which is a kind of poking fun at himself opera. It's a lovely comic opera, but it's about a young man who never had sex, and he was just so pure that they made him king of the Maytime celebration in this small English town. And this is kind of Britten, because he actually stayed with his mother, and he actually didn't have sex until his mother died, and so forth. But he's making fun of it in a very gentle way. And so Albert eventually learns to break loose from his mother and to have a fuller life. But it's just a lovely comic opera full of love of the England that, and the thing about Britten was that he loved England in spite of everything. He founded a festival which still exists, the Aldborough Festival, in his native Sussex, and he left all the love letters that he and Peter Pears exchanged to that festival, so you can see them in the museum. And so he loved it in spite of that. And so Albert Herring is kind of the return, if you will, to the Republic of Love, because by the time he died, he saw that the world was opening up and that it was possible for Albert Herring / Benjamin Britten to have a full life, whether gay or straight. The opera doesn't say, but of course either one is possible. And so England was getting a lot better. So I think that's that book. Now, then there's another one, which is, I deliberately put several years off because my daughter died in December 2019. I've been grieving extensively since then. I've been keeping a journal of my grief and mourning, and I'm still keeping the journal. We just gave the memorial service last week because of COVID. It was postponed, so it was so weird because the family came together and had this service of 20 people in the synagogue, but at least we were able to finally do it. And I want to write a book about grief, but I decided I don't want to do just your usual grief memoir like C.S. Lewis or Joan Didion. I want to talk about Greek tragedy. I teach this course called Tragedy and Philosophy, where we read a bunch of Greek tragedies, but we also read a bunch of philosophers who think that Greek tragedy is important, who think that it has something to say to philosophers, whether right or wrong. Of course, Plato and the Stoics think it's wrong, but they still think it's important to confront it. But then there are others, such as Aristotle, and then we go all the way to Hegel, Schopenhauer, who think it has a positive role to play in thinking about the human predicament. And I end up with Jean-Paul Sartre and Bernard Williams. That's the class anyway. But in this book, I'm going to go back and forth between reflections on tragedy, not just the philosophers, but also the tragedies themselves, and my own experience of grief and mourning, going back and forth between, as it were, real-life tragedy and the constructed tragedies of Greek tragedy, and try to think about questions like, Lessing says, you shouldn't put anything ugly on the page, and that Greek tragedy is good because it keeps bodily ugliness away. But, you know, in telling the story of the death of a person you love, there's stuff that's ugly. Illness is ugly. And should you put that in or should you not put that in? So, you know, it's going to be reflections back and forth between the actual experience and what the philosophers say tragedy can do and what the tragedies themselves actually do. And I'm not ready to write it yet. I think my grief is too recent. So that's intentionally why I put it down the road. The opera book is due in, I think, December 2024. And, you know, I'm thinking about it all the time in my journal of grief. I'm making little sketches of what I might say. And so, you know, eventually I'll be ready to write that book.
Thank you. I shall very much look forward to reading all of these books, and they also continue your project in very good ways. And of course, not least when it comes to your own grief, it's that must make it in a way very different from many other things.
Well, you know, I mean, people have different ways of reacting to grief, and I think often of the Roman philosopher Cicero. Cicero lost an adult daughter. She was around the same age as my daughter was when she died, so I feel I share a lot with Cicero. And he loved his daughter Tullia very much. And so in the last years of his life, when he, of course, was about to be assassinated, and soon was assassinated, his obsession was to build a shrine to memorialize Tullia. So you have all these very sad letters where he's writing to Atticus saying, can you buy some property over here? I could build the shrine there. And it never happened because he got assassinated before that. But what I'm thinking is, actually, my shrine has not one part but three. It's not a physical monument, but the first part was the memorial service where we really did create a kind of artwork around Rachel's life, and it's now all recorded. Music that she loved, beautifully performed, speeches that were beautiful, and so on. But then the second part is my book on animals, because Rachel was a lawyer for animal rights. She worked for an NGO called Friends of Animals, and we co-authored articles together about the rights of whales and dolphins. So I got a lot in the book that's drawn from these articles, and I say so, a whole chapter on whales, and another chapter on whether there could be friendship between humans and animals, which is very much the last article that we wrote together. So that's the second, to build a kind of enduring monument to the cause that was so dear to her and that she worked so hard for during her life. And then the third part of the shrine, so to speak, when I figure out exactly how to do it, will be this book on grief. And I think, you know, that, as I say, I think you have to do that when the grief is at a distance from you, so you really know what you want to put in and what you don't want to put in. It's only a shrine if it has structure and form. I agree with Lessing to that extent. You don't just want to blurt out all the sad, ugly feelings that you have, but you need to give it a shape, both the thoughts and the experiences. So that's my tripartite shrine. Who knows? I'll get some other ideas, and then I may want to do something, maybe it'll have 4 parts, but those are the 3 parts that I can imagine right now.
Thank you so much for sharing these things with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.